In this video, we're going to talk about textures and mapping in Maya. So we saw how we can create basic materials using simple colors or simple values, and also how we can use the procedural maps that we find in Maya. And we created some few examples here of really basic materials. Using the parameters here in Maya, using the Maya Lite version, we can create some basic materials. We can just start to learn what materials are and that they are composed by channels, and inside the channel we can place a map, which can be procedural map and textures. So in this video we will talk about textures. We will talk about images instead of procedural maps. Now, if you want to move forward in the creation of materials, you can check out the guides and videos about the physically based materials, and also using tools like Armor Paint or Substance from Adobe. But here we're going to see some basic um, notions and tools and features that you can use in any 3D software. Now, we imported at the beginning of this course some of these modules from renderpeople.com, and this is a website again, and I'm gonna provide a link in the description, but it's this is just renderpeople.com. So I am downloading here the Maya version for this, and this is to show you that usually when you download and import 3D objects from the web, you will always find the textures made for you. And in this case, this is the most complex texture that you can find, which is an unwrap textures. Is a textures that it's unwrapped around your 3D object. So when we use 3D objects, we are working in 3D space. But when we use materials and textures or procedural maps, we are working in 2D space. So the difficulty is to convert that 2D plane into something in 3D. Now, if I select the object that I import and go to the attribute editor, as we saw also in the previous video, we can see here that we have a series of layers or channels. Inside the channel, we can work with a simple value, which could be from black to white, black meaning 0 and white meaning 100%, or let's say the absence of or the presence of a particular effect. Or we can here apply the textures. So when you see a model that you import and you don't see the textures, you can try to reload that textures, which is probably not seen because it's not in the right folder. And you can click here on edit to check the textures, and this is an example of what an unwrapped texture is. So you can see that each single pixel of this image, each single part, it's representing a part of the 3D object. So this is the 2D space and the UV basically, and we're gonna see that also in the UV editor. And also you will find other more simple situations for mapping. Now, when you place something 2D onto something 3D, that's called mapping basically. So each time you create a polygonal object, whether it's a simple object like a cube or a sphere, or something more complex like an industrial design object or a character, you always need to go through mapping. So if you select here this complex object and you click there in the UV editor, you can open up this additional tool that will help you to create really detailed mapping for your objects. And you can do like packaging with this. If you created, let's say, a cereal box, now each face of the cereal box is gonna have some graphic infographics. So you can define them using a UV editor. Well, actually, the best practice here is to export it into Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator, create the graphics there, and then come back in Maya. Because Maya is not properly a graphic design tool. It's specific for 3D modeling and pretty good for 3D rendering and animation, but not really for graphic design like Photoshop or Illustrator. So eventually you will need to move into another application for graphic design and then come back. And you can see there that folder that the character has in its hands, and that's another object, and it's still mapped on that UV editor. So this is the part where we can assign a texture. So for example, here we already have assigned a texture to the color channel, and with the right click we can access the additional values. We can break that connection. Now that connection now is broken and I don't see the texture anymore. So always remember that to view the textures in the viewport or in the project, you always need to have your textures with you in a folder within the project folder. Always remember that. Otherwise, if you name the textures differently, if you change the name of the subfolder, if you change the position of the folder, that connection it's gonna be broken and you will not see the textures anymore, so be careful about that. So right now we don't have anything. We can click on the checkerboard and we can go here in the shading nodes and we can select 2D textures or 3D textures. We saw some procedural textures. Now we go to File. When you click to File, it's gonna open up the attribute editor again, and in the image name you have to click there in the little folder to find where the textures are stored in your computer. And so this is the way you can, let's say, reconnect or recreate that missing link that is not allowing you to show the texturing inside the 3D scene. So this is why it's always important to keep the textures within the project. Okay, so well, this is not the texture, this is a preview image, and that's the texture right there. So when I find out where the texture is, I can select that and open it up, and that's gonna be reassigned. Now you see some other textures here, but these are for other purposes, and we're gonna see those purposes later. This is the basic and most important texture of all, which is the color texture. In other software, it's called the diffuse channel or diffuse texture. Usually it's called a diffuse texture, not color. And this is the most superficial effect of the material. Now we already saw how we can apply also procedural maps like the checkerboard there on the ground, and you can already see that textures usually are way more realistic than standard procedural maps. So when you work to create something realistic, you probably want to assign realistic textures for not only for the color but also for others. And you cannot use the tiling. We talked about the repetitions or tiling. Well, in this case, textures like the Unwrap textures cannot be repeated. These are textures that only have to be used once. You can see there that if I increase the repetition, of course, it's not like the checkerboard, but it's gonna give me a real strange effect. So procedural maps like the checkerboard or other types of textures, you can repeat them many times. Well, it's actually better because you can cover larger areas, larger surfaces, but in Unwrap packaging or let's say creating a picture frame or a photograph attached to the wall, well, you don't have to repeat the image but once. So let's go back here in the web and let's start to search for some textures. You can directly